I'm very pleased to be here with you all, really. I've wanted to come to Malaysia for years. The dear National Assembly has been inviting me several times and it hadn't worked out, and this time it has. And I want to express my appreciation to the National Assembly for the opportunity to come here and experience fellowship with the Baha'is, really, of Southeast Asia. So many of you are here from all around. We used to be, I hadn't been in this area, but serving in the World Center on the Teaching Center on the House of Justice, we used to be thrilled with the news from Malaysia all the time. It was one of the places we didn't worry about. Maybe we should have, but we weren't worrying about it at that time. And now look at how it's grown and how you are here. You know, Shoghi Effendi said that these gatherings where so many friends come together, it attracts the blessings of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit hovers over this meeting. The Guardian used to say that to the friends too. He said that when you're gathered, the central figures from on high are observing you, watching and sending their blessings on us. We have this wonderful opportunity. We talk about love. We have this particular occasion to express it to each other. The theme about the dispensation of the Bab, we really should be very grateful to Councillor Tehrani for this review of the life of the Bab and the meaning of his sacrifice and his martyrdom and the example of Anis. And I had anticipated that people would probably be speaking about this history. So I thought, well, what aspect should I introduce for us to think about and to reflect on? And apart from these marvelous, inspiring episodes that we need to absorb and, if you will, bring into our bloodstream, into our nervous system, there are aspects which assist us in recognizing the Bab at this bicentenary of his birth that we may not have all thought about recently. Though the friends who have been students of the writings will be familiar with all these things, but this is a kind of a review which will help us to look at the Bab from different aspects. For instance, I've collected some comments and thoughts from particularly the vision of the Guardian of the history of the faith to share here today. I need to put out a clock here, something to keep track of how long I'm speaking. Thank you. First of all, we have the question of his mission. How do we summarize the mission of the Bab in very few words? This is always our challenge. We don't have a lot of time to talk to people. We want to get what's important into what we say or what we think when we reflect, when we remember the Bab, when we think of the Bab. How do we express the whole mission of the Bab in one or two short paragraphs? Then we have the question of his person. What was the Bab like? How can we express to people something of the characteristics of the person of the Bab? Then we have an overview of his ministry. This is a sweep. And we have the marvelous contributions of Shoghi Effendi summarizing and listing the different episodes of and importance of the events of the heroic age of the faith. Finally, we have a question of his writings, brief look at that, which are the most important ones of them, what was their central purpose. That, of course, includes his covenant, binding us to the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest. And finally, we have a characterization of his rank, his position in the spiritual evolution of mankind. In all of this, I've always felt guided by the writings of Shoghi Effendi. Now, Shoghi Effendi, as you know, he edited and translated the Dawnbreakers. So he's really the source of this gift that we have of the history of the Bab. And then, for that work, he read a lot of non-Baha'i literature by people who weren't believers, observers, European historians. Nicola, Gobineau, Brown, marvelous scholars who, in a sense, legitimized for scholarship these episodes of the life of the Bab. It's so marvelous that we have that. And Shoghi Effendi put them as footnotes. He developed and himself placed footnotes in his edited version of Nabiul's narrative. So those are very interesting to go back and look at too. Many of them are in French. One of the believers in America years ago dedicated themselves to translating the French footnotes in the Dawnbreakers, and that's published separately. So if you're not familiar with French, you can find them there. And they make a marvelous contribution to an outside view, if you will, of the Bab and his mission. To give us an example of how Shoghi Effendi would summarize the most important points when he was describing some aspect of the faith, or the faith itself in a whole. We have two documents that Shoghi Effendi prepared. One was prepared for the High Commissioner of Palestine early on in 1933. Shoghi Effendi was writing to him. The municipality of Haifa was wanting to build a road directly in front of the Shrine of the Bab, which would have become a traffic road of traffic. And Shoghi Effendi was pressed to bring to the attention of the High Commissioner, the highest authority in the land, the sacredness of the site of the Bab. So he had to summarize the coming of the Bab, who the Bab was, and what the Shrine of the Bab meant to a world of followers of the Bab and his faith throughout the world. Needless to say, his intention in preparing this document was fully confirmed by God, and the government didn't build a road in front of the Shrine of the Bab. We have the path of the pilgrims instead, and that's quite appropriate. So he opens, he says, the forerunner of the faith, he's talked to him about that, he wants to describe the faith. He said, the forerunner of the faith was Mirza Ali Muhammad of Shiraz, known as the Bab, the Gate, who proclaimed on May 23rd, 1844, his twofold mission as an independent manifestation of God and herald of one greater than himself, who would inaugurate a new and unprecedented era in the religious history of mankind. Seems to me, friends, in any presentation that we make, we want to get these points across if we're going to describe something about the Bab's mission. He was the forerunner of the faith, he was the Bab, and he proclaimed a twofold mission. Do you remember now what the twofold mission is? Independent manifestation of God, herald of one greater than himself. This is an introduction way back in 33, before the Dawnbreakers was translated, before we had God Passes By with its fuller explanation, before Shoghi Effendi's magisterial letter, the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, where he defines in great detail the independent manifestation of the Bab and also his role as herald of one greater than himself. So these are some preliminary points. Again, Shoghi Effendi was asked by the United Nations, who was looking into the status of the condition of Palestine, thank you, as the state of Israel was being contemplated, what was the role of the different religions in the country? And the commission of scholars that prepared this for the United Nations met in Haifa, and they had to ask Shoghi Effendi if he would state what the role of the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land was. What a brilliant moment, really, for us. And Shoghi Effendi has prepared a statement that in its succinctness and in its accuracy can't be compared with anything else that we have. He starts this statement, which has been published in Baha'i World books in the past. You can find it in separate editions also. He says, the Baha'i faith revolves around three central figures, the first of whom was a youth, a native of Shiraz, known as Mirza Ali Muhammad, known as the Bab, who in May 1844, at the age of 25, advanced the claim of being the herald who, according to the sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself, whose mission would be, according to those same scriptures, to inaugurate an era of righteousness and peace. All right, friends, we read that. What can we capture? What should we hold from this that we can use in our statements? I think different of us might focus on different things. A herald who, according to sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself, but also that he's to inaugurate an era of righteousness and peace. How do we characterize the future Baha'i era? What are the words we should choose? Here we have an example in Shoghi Effendi, an era of righteousness and peace. That's what we're working for. That is what we're working for. An era, he goes on to state, that would be hailed as the consummation of all previous dispensations and initiate a new cycle in the religious history of mankind. Oh, friends, how much of our Baha'i teachings line up under these 2 points? The consummation of all previous dispensations. What marvelous statements we have from Baha'u'llah, how the faith itself is all the truths, all the beauty of past dispensations has been renewed, refreshed, and set forth in the scriptures of our faith. And now we're into a cycle of fulfillment rather than a cycle of prophecies. And look at this is the room of the fulfillment of those prophecies. Amazing. This is a message that was written by Shoghi Effendi in 1947. We come to the question of the person of the Bab. Of course, we would all, I think, describe with love and with whatever vision we've derived if we've read carefully the Dawnbreakers. How does Shoghi Effendi, when he wishes to set forth and characterize the person of the Bab, what attributes does he mention? Friends, I'm going to read you two sets of them. One is from God Passes By, the foreword of God Passes By, and the other is from the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. They're parallel with each other, but slightly different in their order and emphasis. It seems to me if we want to talk, we want to describe the Bab, we need to focus on these characterizations, along with whatever we have absorbed of the history of the faith, to be able to speak about it. Look how the vision of the Bab comes forward from these few phrases. He's describing the first of the four periods which he surveys and reviews in God Passes By, in the foreword to God Passes By. And he says that this first period, which is 1844 to 1853, and which constitutes the first quarter of the book, God Passes By, centers around the gentle, the youthful, and irresistible person of the Bab. Gentle, youthful, irresistible. Matchless in his meekness, imperturbable in his serenity, magnetic in his utterance, and unrivaled in the dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry. You can line up so many different stories. You could put these as the title of different sections of a booklet and line up the episodes that demonstrate the irresistible character of the Bab, his meekness, his serenity, the matchless and magnetic utterances that he spoke and how they affected the people that heard him. Prior to that, earlier on, Shoghi Effendi, in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, paints for us a picture of what he calls the supreme theophany. It's written on the 90th anniversary of the founding of the faith. Interestingly enough, Shoghi Effendi in 1944, celebrating the centenary of the founding of the faith, his emphasis is on the founding of the faith and not on the 100th anniversary of the declaration of the Bab, although it's implicit in it. He calls that anniversary not the anniversary of the declaration of the Bab, but the founding of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Some scholars later said, but this was the faith of the Bab. Why does he include the Bab with Baha'u'llah? You can see, friends, from these explanations of the Guardian and from the writings that he cites in support of this, that it's one faith we have. And one of the great features, which we'll mention a bit in more detail later, is that the Bab reigns together with Baha'u'llah over the destinies of our faith. And that this is unique in all of recorded religious history. From the Muslim point of view, from the teachings of the Quran, we understand that John the Baptist was a messenger of God. He brought laws, he brought teachings. He heralded the coming of the Christ. He baptized the Christ. But no, there's no indication, nor is it repeated in Christianity, that he reigns together with the Christ over the Christian dispensation. What an amazing opening dispensation of a 500,000-year cycle, the Baha'i cycle proclaimed by the cause. What an amazing thing that this opening dispensation, and then through future history, the Bab reigns together with Baha'u'llah. Now, how does Shoghi Effendi describe that connection? It's very interesting. How do you get two manifestations, two independent shining of light? You know, they're in the skies, there are some stars that are twin stars. They have two stars both shining on the planets that are circling around them. Quite interesting. In every case, as I understand it from the science that's available to us, one of those stars is fixed. It doesn't move. It's the center. And the second star revolves around it. This makes for very interesting multicolored shadows of the people living on those planets. We have this multicolored spiritual inheritance because we have the Bab shining on us and Baha'u'llah shining on us. Two independent sources of revelation. So quite, Shoghi Effendi says this is the supreme feature, the special characteristic of this dispensation. Shoghi Effendi talks right away in the opening phrases where he's describing Baha'u'llah. And by the way, go look and see how Baha'u'llah is described in this same way with a few short, terse phrases, very meaningful. He says, the Bab allied those subordinate in rank and invested with the authority of presiding with him over the destinies of this supreme dispensation. There shines upon this mental picture, which he's painting for us, the youthful glory of the Bab, infinite in his tenderness, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, matchless in the dramatic circumstances of his short yet eventful life. You find that published in the World Order of Baha'u'llah Letters. The message that's been entitled The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. When I became a Baha'i back in the 1950s, while Shoghi Effendi was still alive, one of the prerequisites to become a member of the Baha'i community was to study the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, this letter, and the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha, and Baha'u'llah in the New Era, and write an essay why you believe in Baha'u'llah, which the local assembly would then study and decide whether you could become a Baha'i or not. They took a long time deciding about me, I can tell you. Friends, the administration has its ups and downs, you know. I met a local assembly. It was a small local assembly in one district in the LA area. And I met with them, and they didn't ask me too many questions. Somebody warned me, you better find out when Mullah Hossein was born. And they met with me, they asked a few questions, and then they said, we're sorry, the house is very small, and the assembly has to meet in private, you know. Would you mind standing in this street while we review your case? I was in the street. It was March. It was cold. And 10 minutes passed, 15 minutes passed, 20 minutes passed. Then the door opened. I thought, boy, they really had a hard time deciding about whether they would let me in. And the chairman said to me, so sorry to keep you waiting so long. He said, the assembly hasn't met for 6 months, and they had some business. They wanted to have the closing prayer with you, and that's why it's taken all this time. Well, that was a relief to me because I thought I wasn't going to get in. All right. Here again we have youthful glory, the irresistible person of the Bab, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, unrivaled in the dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry. These are things, friends, we can speak about. There's another facet to this which I feel is helpful to us. When you want to describe the shrine, the influence of the 3 shrines in the Holy Land, it's very interesting to think of these characteristics, because the friends have different feelings in the different shrine. You go to the shrine of the Bab, it has a certain dynamic immediacy about it. At least these are personal impressions, but we hear it over and over from the friends. You go to the shrine of Baha'u'llah and you have this serenity and this peace and glory of God there. So this is quite interesting from that point of view. How are we doing on time here? Okay. Now the question of that was the mission, the short mission statement, so to speak. Now we have the question of his ministry. How do we convey? How do we understand? How do we resolve our own understanding of this period of the 8 years, the years of the ministry of the Bab? Again, we go back to this statement that was prepared for the government, for the United Nations survey of religions in the Holy Land. Shoghi Effendi focuses us now on the ministry of the Bab, then he of course goes on to the ministry of Baha'u'llah and that of Abdul Baha. The one which we're interested in today is of course related to the Bab. I'm doing these a bit in reverse order because I think it's easier to understand them. The other overview is the one from the foreword to God Passes By. The foreword to God Passes By, friends, if you haven't read God Passes By, at least get the foreword and read the foreword, because it's a summary of the whole book of what's going to happen. And it's very helpful to have in mind. With regard to his ministry, this is now in like a single paragraph. Shoghi Effendi takes the whole ministry of the Bab and sets it forth for us. He says, swift and severe persecution launched by the organized forces of church and state in his native land precipitated successively his arrest, his exile to the mountains of Azerbaijan, his imprisonment in the fortresses of Maku and Cherik, and his execution in July 1850 by a firing squad in the public square of Tabriz. No less than 20,000 of his followers were put to death with such barbarous cruelty as to evoke the warm sympathy and the unqualified admiration of a number of Western writers, diplomats, travelers, and scholars, some of whom were witnesses of these abominable outrages and were moved to record them in their books and diaries. That's from the statement to the United Nations Committee. Consider now a parallel one from the foreword to God Passes By. This is the first period he's describing of the 4 that he surveys and characterizes in the whole book of God Passes By. It begins with the declaration of his mission, culminates in his martyrdom, and ends in a veritable orgy of religious massacre, revolting in its hideousness. It's characterized by 9 years of fierce and relentless contest, whose theater was the whole of Persia, in which above 10,000 heroes laid down their lives, in which 2 sovereigns of the Qajar dynasty and their wicked ministers participated, and which was supported by the entire Shia ecclesiastical hierarchy, by the military resources of the state, and by the implacable hostility of the masses. That's about as tight a history as you can get of the period of the Bab. Friends, you know, looking at the Dawnbreakers and these episodes that we want to be remembering leading up to this bicentenary period, Iran was convulsed with the revelation. The revelation had an impact far greater than has been allowed to be recorded in Persian history. They've tried to cleanse it and lessen it and reduce it to nothing. But it was the immediacy of the Bab's mission. You can imagine, there's no, these were societies that lived off of coffee houses. There wasn't a newspaper. There was no, phone in your pocket that you could read the headlines, what's going on. Word of mouth, and you know how stories change from, great were the miracles of the Bab, but even greater was the account of them all over the country. Everybody was listening to everything that was going on. They were hearing it, and all were alert to hear what is the message of the Bab? What is his purpose? And they were so thrilled with all kinds of stories. Now, if you want a fuller overview of the ministry, still not lengthy, but very, very purposeful, you look at the table of contents of God Passes By. Shoghi Effendi there has organized the whole 9-year period into 5 sections, 5 chapters. I want to refer briefly to them here because it'll give you an idea. It will cause you to remember things you should remember. And if you're not familiar with the subject and what it refers to, you will wish to investigate and inform yourself properly, responsibly, if you will. The ministry of the Bab, the birth of the Bab, first part. The birth of the Babi revelation, declaration of the Bab's mission, enrollment of the letters of the living, the Bab's pilgrimage to Mecca, the Bab's arrest and departure for Isfahan. Filled so many episodes, so moving about, you remember the plague in Shiraz after they were going to arrest and detain the Bab and thinking of killing him. The Bab's sojourn in Isfahan and the marvelous events that took place there with the conversion of the governor. The second section is on the Bab's captivity in Azerbaijan, and it includes the significance of his captivity, his incarceration in Maku and Cherik, his examination in Tabriz, where he declared so openly that he was the promised Qaim, remembering that the governor of Azerbaijan at that time was the crown prince who was to become Nasruddin Shah. Nasruddin Shah saw the Bab declare he was the promised Qaim, was sitting in that gathering. His examination, in Tabriz, and the punishment that they meted out to him, his writings, his covenant, and then Shoghi Effendi's review of the conference of Badasht. Then he goes into these upheavals in Mazandaran, which of course was Sheikh Tabarsi, all the events of Sheikh Tabarsi, Neriz, the revolt in Nariz and ending with the martyrdom of Vahid, Zanjan, the last. Just recently, my wife and I have been reading these passages out loud to ourselves in the morning. We have a little devotional, and the extent of the involvement of thousands of people along with Hojat in Zanjan that were resisting the pressures of the government and of the clergy to renounce the faith. It's an amazing spectacle. You must go back and visit that again if you haven't looked at it. And finally, the account of the 7 martyrs of Tehran, which, as you recall, included the uncle that raised the Bab himself. The Bab, overcome with grief with the hearing of all these things that happened. Then the section on the execution of the Bab, the events preceding his death, circumstances attending his martyrdom, which have been so beautifully recounted here, the tributes that were paid to his memory, the parallel between his mission and that of Jesus Christ. We'll come back to that a bit later on too. The significance of his mission. All right, Shoghi Effendi summarizes all these things for us and draws quotations from various sources and the comments of Baha'u'llah himself on these events. Then we have the attempt on the life of the Shah and its consequences. That chapter contains circumstances attending the attack on Nasruddin Shah. What was the background? How was Baha'u'llah's innocence established? Because he was such an important Babi figure, they felt he must be responsible in some way for the attempt on the life of the Shah. Then the massacre of the Babis in Tehran, and it spread to other cities, just merciless. Anybody that there was a whisper of the possibility they could be a Babi was grabbed and killed, and the wives and the children. Friend, there's so many of these things that even in our own time, with the revolution and the persecution of the Baha'is in 1979 on, we don't realize all the little terrible things that happened that aren't news because they weren't executed. For example, the story of the officials entering into the home of a young Baha'i family and humiliating the wife in front of the husband and taking from her hands the baby in her arms over to the samovar and sticking the mouth of the baby on the samovar and opening the boiling water in the face of the parents. I mean, that's not international news, but think of the implications of that. An old man who can't buy any food because he's a Baha'i in one village, so he walks at great pain to himself to another village. And when the village ruffians realize that he's a Baha'i from another village, they go to him and they put out their cigarettes in his eyes. This is modern times. We were hearing this as serving in the Holy Land. The friends have been through miserable times. You hear about persecutions, but when it comes down to the individual events, it becomes very, very heartrending. I remember Mr. Olinga was visiting Buenos Aires in South America, and he was saying he'd been with the Guardian. He was describing his pilgrimage, and he mentioned that the question had arisen, why Nasruddin Shah escaped punishment? All the other officials and people who were involved in the persecution suffered dire consequences, and he didn't. He lived on, and his reign was 50 years as Shah. And what he said, the Guardian said, was that it was a mercy, a compassion to Nasruddin Shah because of what the Babis had done to him. that God prolonged his time here. Until his golden jubilee, on the 50th anniversary of his reign, he was shot at the mosque and died as a consequence. And Shoghi Effendi, now consider we were speaking, I was translating to Spanish for the Hand of the Cause, and the audience was mostly former Catholics and some of the older Catholic ladies, very sensitive to the question that came up next, because Shoghi Effendi said, and when Nasruddin Shah died, he went straight to hell. One of the older ladies started fanning herself in the back of the room, and then I thought, this is getting a bit delicate, but let's hear what happens next. So I turned to Mr. Olinga, and he said, and then the Guardian said, and he's still there. At which point, the lady who was fanning herself fainted off her chair. The visions of childhood, brainwashing about hell, going to hell, and what's going to happen to you. And the Baha'is, who were more than happy to say, well, hell is, it's not really real. It's not a physical hell with real physical fire. It's worse than that, I'm sorry to say, but we don't like to think about it. Anyway, that was interesting. I also heard something, this is anecdotal completely. Rhea Khanum said that when she was, after her marriage, one time Shoghi Effendi was jesting with her, and he said, Nasruddin Shah went to hell. And he said, when Muhammad Ali, the archbreaker of Baha'u'llah's covenant, when he died, he went to hell too. And then Nasruddin Shah was complaining. He says, where am I to go? Where am I to go? You expect me to live here with this Muhammad Ali? Crazy. Now, summary a vision, if you will, of what was the Bab's position from the words of Baha'u'llah. Now you can imagine, there are endless tablets and references to this, but out of all those, our beloved Guardian, who surveys with this divine infallible vision of the cause of God, he chooses certain titles and characteristics to impress upon us how Baha'u'llah views the Bab. Shoghi Effendi writes, he says, the Bab, acclaimed by Baha'u'llah as the essence of essences, the sea of seas. Two very interesting titles. These are referred to also in the dispensation, if you're aware of it. As the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve, whose rank excelleth that of all the prophets, and whose revelation transcendeth the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones. We're familiar with the phrase about the king of the messengers of God in the tablet of Ahmad with reference to the Bab. There is a hierarchy among the prophets of God. And to think of the Bab simply in the terms of being a herald of Baha'u'llah and not really having a full role of prophecy is a mistake. His mission outranks the mission of all the previous manifestations of God. We counted the words of revelation that we had access to. Baha'u'llah had left a box of the writings of the Bab to Abdul Baha, and passed on to the Guardian and to the House of Justice. And now they've all been cataloged and they've all been digitized. So can you imagine how many of the words of the Bab of revelation we have from the Bab. They summarized 5 million single words, That is greater than the combined scriptures of all the known religions of the past. He alone has equaled all the previous revelations and then gone beyond that. I'll come to what Baha'u'llah did in another session with you. So these are 6 references from the Bab that are also cited in God Passes By. You know about the titles of the primal point, the comparing of this point round whom the realities of prophets and messengers revolve has been extended to the shrine of the Bab as well. Shoghi Effendi mentions that. Continuing on with the theme of the writings of the Bab, if we're asked about the writings of the Bab, mostly we have previously known about the history of the Bab, episodes in his ministry and so on, and with some reference to his writings, but not usually to the content of his writings. For those of you who are interested, the House of Justice encouraged Nader Saidi to incorporate his studies of the texts of the Bab in a scholarly book which is called Gate of the Heart. And there you can find all kinds of references to the content of his independent revelation, really. The first 3 years were about the deep spiritual meanings of everything to do with spirituality and religion. One of his writings, the best known, characterized by Baha'u'llah as the most important, was the Qayyum al-Asma. And we've heard the counselor refer this morning to the revelation of the commentary on the Surah of Joseph. And that's the title of that is the Qayyum al-Asma. And it began on the very first night of his declaration. He revealed the first chapter in the presence of Mullah Hussein. This summary of that book, again, and you go to God Passes By, you find everything that you need. He's summarized in a full, long paragraph the nature, contents of the Qayyum al-Asma. Probably obviously you're aware of the Persian Bayan. This is the book of laws of the Bab revealed in Maku during the Bab's imprisonment in Maku. Shoghi Effendi, commenting on the writings, says, alike in the magnitude of the writings emanating from his pen, and in the diversity of the subjects treated in his writings, his revelation stands wholly unparalleled in the annals of any previous religion. That's quite a statement. In a paragraph, he says, no less arresting is the variety of themes presented by these voluminous writings, such as prayers, homilies, orations, tablets of visitation, scientific treatises, doctrinal dissertations, exhortations, commentaries on the Quran and on various traditions, epistles to the highest religious and ecclesiastical dignitaries of the realm, and laws and ordinances for the consolidation of his faith and the direction of its activities. There's a work of the Bab called Panshan, which means 5 modes. Mode in the sense of a category of revelation. And the Bab
describes, he repeats 4 modes of revelation which existed in the Islamic dispensation. And then 1 new mode that he adds himself. And just briefly summarizes just the mention of this, again, it teases you to go and study further into the writings of the Bab and understand about them as part of your overall survey and understanding of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. He said the first mode of revelation are the divine verses, the ayat, the verses that come from God, and they're voiced in the voice of God. We remember Baha'u'llah was challenged. He said he is claimed to be God, and he explains in the Kitab-i-Gan that when the manifestation of God claims to speak in the voice of God, when he says, I am God, verily, verily, I am God, this is the essence of self-effacement of the manifestation. He has so removed his person that God speaks through him in the first person. I am God. It's a very interesting concept. Now, this mode of revelation is characterized by the phrase, I am God. The second mode of revelation, he says, are prayers. And this corresponds somewhat to the inner state of the Bab, that he was the source of revelation and divinity. And then the person of the Bab, in which he assumes, as Baha'u'llah does in some of his tablets and writings, that he's less than anyone. He's submissive entirely to the will of God. So you have the station of revelation, and then you have the individual soul of the manifestation, which always manifests this terrific meekness and humbleness. The second stage, he said, has to do with prayers and praise of the first mode of revelation. Prayers referring to the first stage of revelation, the first mode of revelation. And that is characterized by the phrase, Thou art God. The third mode of revelation are commentaries upon the first and the second modes, in which the mode of revelation, he said, is He is God. Descriptions, commentaries on the content of the first stage. And the fourth stage, he said, are scientific treatises and other dissertations of the manifestation on a great variety of things. He is God who does this and explains that and so on. Then the Bab says, I have brought a fifth mode of revelation, and that's the mode of all the previous 4 stages, but this time in the Persian language, in Farsi. And those are the 5 he mentioned. Baha'u'llah, when he revealed the tablet, the Surat al-Haykal, where he describes the relationship of his manifestation with the divinity, he says that he has revealed within the Haykal, which includes the composite Haykal, which includes the tablets to the kings and rulers, 9 modes of revelation. We don't have a confirmation of exactly what those 9 modes are, but again, Shoghi Effendi lists, as I read to you, the variety of themes presented in the writings of the Bab. He does that also for Baha'u'llah, and you can see that the modes are really endless. And Baha'u'llah says himself, he says, we could reveal in many more modes if it were needed. So, something of the writings of the Bab. Interesting, he says, it was during the Bab's incarceration in the fortress of Marku that he, according to the testimony of Sheikh Hassani Sunusi, who transcribed during those 9 months the verses dictated by the Bab to his amanuensis, that the Bab revealed no less than 9 commentaries on the whole of the Quran. Shoghi Effendi highlights that in the Bayan, in the 3rd Vahed, in the 3rd section of the Bayan, An explicit reference is made to the name of the promised one, and in anticipation of the order which in a later age was to be identified with his revelation. He states that this deserves to rank as one of the most significant statements recorded in any of the Bab's writings, and I'll quote it for you here from the Persian Bayan. Well is it with him who fixeth his gaze upon the order of Baha'u'llah and rendereth thanks unto his Lord, for he will assuredly be made manifest. God hath indeed irrevocably ordained it in the Bayan. Now, friends, at this time, Baha'u'llah was not known as Baha'u'llah. There's this reference to the order of Baha'u'llah. And Shoghi Effendi identifies this with the world order, the references to the transforming, vibrating influence of Baha'u'llah's new world order in the Aqdas. And you will recall that after the proceedings, the time of the conference of Badash, the Bab gave titles to the various letters of the living and addressed Mirza Hossein Ali as Baha'u'llah. So there's this identity with those words, and then you'll remember that one of the treasures of the Bab period is a derivation of 360, I think, derivations from the Arabic word Baha in his exquisite handwriting of the Bab. I don't know if you've seen examples of the Bab's handwriting. It's extraordinary. It's so small and so beautiful. So this is just a slight reference here then to his writings in general. Continuing on with our theme of the rank and station of the Bab, further words of the guardian for our edification and guidance. It says, dearly beloved friends, that the Bab, the inaugurator of the Babi dispensation, is fully entitled to rank as one of the self-sufficient manifestations of God. Self-sufficient manifestation is also sometimes termed in the writings manifestation endowed with constancy. It means he brings a book and his own set of laws, and that those laws then reign. Other manifestations may appear afterwards and write commentaries or explanations of his writings, but these are the self-sufficient manifestations of God. He's been as such, he's been invested with sovereign power and authority and exercises all the rights and prerogatives of independent prophethood. This is yet another fundamental verity which the message of Baha'u'llah insistently proclaims and which its followers must uncompromisingly uphold. That he is not to be regarded merely as an inspired precursor of the Baha'i revelation. That in his person, as he himself bears witness in the Persian Bayan, the object of all the prophets gone before him has been fulfilled. This is the truth which I feel my duty to demonstrate and emphasize, the guardian said. We would assuredly be failing in our duty to the faith we profess, and would be violating one of its basic and sacred principles if in our words or by our conduct we hesitate to recognize the implications of this root principle of Baha'i belief, or refuse to uphold unreservedly its integrity and demonstrate its truth. And it's at this point in the explanation of Shoghi Effendi in this World Order letter, he makes reference to the motives that caused him to bring forth the Dawnbreakers, the book of the Dawnbreakers, he says this. He says, indeed, the chief motive actuating me to undertake the task of editing and translating Nabil's immortal narrative has been to enable every follower of the faith in the West to better understand and more readily grasp the tremendous implications of his exalted station, and to more ardently admire and love him. You know, Nabil had collected some of these stories. He himself testifies that he interviewed as many people as he could during trips that he made to Iran after the Baha'i period. Those were involved in Sheikh Tabarsi and in some of the revolts that were described, Neriz, Tehran, Neriz, and Zanjan. And Baha'u'llah, at one point, I think it was 1888, he said to Nabil that it was time for him to compose a book of his experiences and the accounts that he'd seen and heard of. And he kind of put him to the test. He said that I want you to come every Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and present me with a fascicle of so many pages. And week after week, he was waiting for that. And Nabil dedicated himself. He had to put all of his attention on that. And Mirza Musa helped him a lot in this, Baha'u'llah's brother. And he presented these, and then Aga Jan would read passages from them to Baha'u'llah, and eventually Baha'u'llah answers in 2 tablets to Nabil certain suggestions and changes that he needs to create for Nabil's narrative. So it was directly under the supervision of Baha'u'llah that Nabil's narrative was created by Nabil. And later in the time of Abdul Baha, he had some comments and views of his own, and finally Shoghi Effendi edits the whole thing for an English version. That is what we have. What a work of love he gave us, a work of sacrifice. Now, the time passes, and sometimes we're not always familiar with some of the letters of the Guardian about Nabil's narrative. I want to quote a few passages here to you to incentivize all of us that we return and read this book now ourselves. Shoghi Effendi writes, this is from a letter written on his behalf, I would strongly urge you to utilize to the utmost possible extent the wealth of authentic material gathered in Nabil's stirring narrative, and to encourage the youth to master and digest the facts recorded therein as a basis for their future work in the teaching field, and as a sustenance to their spiritual life and activities in the service of the cause. What a terrific emphasis. So all you youth out there, master and digest the facts of the Dawnbreakers is the challenge that you have before you. Don't stop these other activities that are going on to do that. This is a separate level of individual study of the writings which we need to keep on with. There's some hours of the day we can't do the collective activities, and those hours, let us fill them with a review and study of these basic memories and that the house is highlighting for us. Again, Shoghi Effendi in a letter said, no one can read the Dawnbreakers and remain cold and unreceptive. The deeds of those heroic souls are bound to stir the reader and win his support. Who can see what they experienced in the path of God? Who can see what they've experienced in the path of God and remain apathetic? Again,
He was deeply gratified to learn that the reading of the Dawnbreakers has deepened your knowledge of the cause and has inflamed you with new courage and faith. The tale of these immortal heroes of God, so well narrated by the powerful pen of Nabil, is indeed stimulating and spiritually uplifting. It gives the reader a new vision of the cause and unfolds before his eyes the glory of this new manifestation in a manner hitherto unknown. Nabil's narrative is not merely a narrative. It is a book of meditation. Interesting. It does not only teach, it actually inspires and incites to action. It quickens and stimulates our dormant energies and makes us soar on a higher plane. It is thus of an invaluable help to the historian as well as to every teacher and expounder of the cause. Glorious letter. This is quoted in Shoghi Effendi, The Range and Power of His Pen, which is a book written by Ali Nakhchivan and published out of Italy. That's the only place that letter appears so far. Shoghi Effendi says he fully approves the idea of holding study classes for the deepening of the friends. The deeper the friends go in their understanding of their teachings, the more firm and steadfast they will become, and the more unwavering in their support of the institutions of the faith. And if I'm allowed to add a few words here, and the plans of the institutions of the faith, because they need our support. Books such as the Agon, Some Answered Questions, and the Dawnbreakers should be mastered by every Baha'i. They should read these books over and over again. The last book will show you how the faith was ushered into the world and how its early adherents heroically faced martyrdom and suffering in their desire to establish the cause throughout the world. Knowing the life of these heroes will create in us the urge to follow their footsteps and achieve the same. Friends, we're really standing on the shoulder of these terrific heroes. And you know, I think it was to Martha Root, she reports that the Guardian said that not all the heroes of the faith are saints. People had their shortcomings, but they still were heroic and they died as martyrs. But Shoghi Effendi adds, he said, but all the saints are heroes. If you attain to sanctity and detachment in the cause of God, that's a heroic act in itself and has a great influence on everyone around us if we can manage that. I think we've come to the end of the session, and this hopefully significant review of the writings from the Guardians, the words of the Guardian himself. And I hope you'll go and find these characterizations of the Bab, the person of the Bab, and use them in your teaching leading up and your understanding leading up to the commemoration of the bicentenary of his birth.